Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Good to have you back again. We're going to be studying John chapter 10 today. By the way, if you have questions for Mike and I, we'd love to have them. We continue to collect them as we go, and when we have a set of them, we'll use another opportunity to go through questions. If you have any comments or questions, send them to questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Okay, questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Good to have you again, Mike. We are starting a new year, and Happy New Year, everyone. As we just closed out the Christmas season, again, one of the devotionals I gave, I forget where I was, a lot of little Bible studies and things I do online or with people, and one of them had asked about the Magi, and so I briefly talked about them. And the one thing I like to mention to people, that when you come to Matthew 2, verse 1, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, it must have been some time had passed because they're going to come to a house, remember. In the days of Herod the king, behold, and we have in most translations the phrase wise men. So in our pageantry, at Christmas time, we have people dressing up as kings, sometimes three because of the three gifts, and they come. But the interesting thing is that word is repeated only one other time in the New Testament. Magi, of course, it's magoi here, wise men, plural. That's two words for one Greek word, magoi, M-A-G-O-I. Magos, the singular form, is used in Acts 13, verses 6 and 8. And there, most translators have sorcerer. Okay, So interesting that, again, we're finding that our English translations like to smooth things out for the sake of the audience. If we had sorcerer in Acts or Matthew 2, verse 1, sorcerers from the east came to Jerusalem, it would stun us. But let me, again, what that makes us do, especially as DCW people, is stop and think, what was God doing in sending, or let's back off that maybe and say, this isn't Yahweh at work as much as his created order that, as put into play in Genesis 11 and so forth, reflected in Deuteronomy 32 and played out in Psalm 82, that God has set in order a world or a cosmology that includes not just divine beings that are in charge of different locales, but also stars and planets that are put in place and can be read for information. Now, we have to be careful there because astrology as a concept was disallowed to the early Israelites. They were not to look up into the stars and get information. They were to, go to Yahweh for that and go to Moses for that and to the proper spokesman. Yet we have Gentiles doing that. These are men from the east, Babylon, Persia, coming across the Arabian desert, led by cosmic signs of some kind. And all I want to say is, then I'll give it to you, Mike. I find this to be a divine counsel idea in the sense that it's putting a stamp of approval on a world that does have some degree put in order by God, a world that does have signs built into it. And it's not stunning to us then that these astrologers can figure out the signs that God himself has put there. So I'm not offended by that at all. I think it's part of the story. And what do you think?
Well, it's funny enough, like a few weeks ago, I actually did a sermon, one of the last sermons I did for my church for the 2025 year. It was on the Magi. And so it's actually, there are actually two other occasions where that word magos or magi appears. It's with Simon the sorcerer. That's typically how it's translated in English. But it's also used again in Acts 13 when Paul encounters a Jewish sorcerer and false prophet. So it's also used there as well. It is kind of strange because that word, by the time Matthew's gospel is written down, it's taking on that darker tone of a sorcerer, a magician, some sort of practitioner of occult stuff. But when we get closer to when Jesus was born, it was describing essentially like this kind of old school magi of astrologers. They may have had a connection to Daniel because in Daniel chapter 2, in one of the Greek translations, it mentions that Daniel is actually made essentially the boss or the one who has authority over all of the magi of Babylon. And so you got that interesting connection that's happening. But, Dr. Heiser, Mike actually made this point that astrology was not necessarily actually forbidden by the serious Jew or the serious Christian of the first century. It's a very nuanced kind of thing, though, because they weren't supposed to worship the stars. They weren't supposed to look at the stars as though that the stars control one's fate. But based on Genesis 1:14, based on Psalm 19, based on other places in the Old Testament, there is this idea that God essentially can use celestial objects as though they're like billboards, messaging some sort of divine message and intention. And the other thing I pointed out to my congregation, just that time period, just within the Second Temple time period of Caesar Augustus is around, all these other events are happening. There was a feeling in the air. And 2 Roman historians mentioned it, and even Josephus mentions it. There was this rumor that a king would be born in the Judean region. And these Latin-speaking historians described it that this king possibly would be the ruler of the world, but come from Judea for some reason. And so, the way I started it out simply is that they saw the star. There is this feeling in the culture and in the air. Maybe they have some knowledge or some sort of nascent memory from Daniel's days, but they make the 900-mile journey from probably Babylon all the way to Jerusalem initially, because the assumption is if there's a newborn king, probably is being born in Herod's household. Let's go to Jerusalem.
Right.
And let's give homage to him. But the journey of the Magi from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, something shifted in them. That by the time we get to when they finally see Mary and the baby boy, they don't just prostrate. They fall face down to the ground. And Matthew then adds the extra word typically used as worship with it to make it very clear. Something shifted in them. They went from just giving homage to now, we're going to be worshiping you. And part of my conclusion that they really were is that when they are given the dream right afterwards, because Joseph is the only other one within those first 2 chapters who are given dreams. And they actually listen to the dream. They break all protocol. They don't go back to Herod like they're supposed to. They offend an official political figure and just go a different way because they're listening. That would have been dangerous
to do.
Yeah, and because they're listening to what the message in the dream said. Essentially, they are now allegiant to whatever understanding they might have had at that moment. They knew something has changed. We are not listening to Herod. We're not listening to general culture and protocol. We're going to listen to what this dream told us to do. And that was part of my contention, is that they became part of God's family.
Nice.
That they may not been full-blown, Trinitarian Christians, right? At that point, who knows?
Right.
But
and they probably stayed Gentile. Again, here's a nice proof text for the coming Cornelius story in Acts. But here are Gentiles who come in as Gentiles and leave as Gentiles, but they're going to be, from what we know, as you've just properly described, worshipers of the Messiah. So that's cool. Well, that's cool.
And you know what Ron, there was one more thing that it was hilarious. This past summer, my wife and I, we went to Europe to do like a riverboat cruise. And one of the sites I finally realized we visited was actually the official Roman Catholic Cathedral of the Magi in Cologne. And I mean, it really was just like an amazing sight, but it was just kind of interesting that there is legends and history supposedly that these Magi eventually then came to realize, wait, we met him?
Oh, okay.
And so, it's such an interesting thing, but like, we don't know anything else much about them after they head back home.
Right. Yeah.
They did something that was very clearly, they had more loyalty to whoever gave them the dream than to Herod.
Nicely done. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll meet them someday and get to hear the whole story. That would be fun. John chapter 10, it comes right on the heels of John 9. We ended last time with Jesus saying to a group of men who should have been the leaders of Israel, he said, your sin remains. And I take that to be the context then of chapter 10, when he says, most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber. He's probably nodding at these men he just talked to. We'll talk about the identity of the thief and the robber coming up. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him, the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. Again, a lot of people or a lot of items or personifications that have to be identified here. You got a thief and a robber and a shepherd and a fold and a doorkeeper and all sorts of things, but we'll put it all together here. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. I think that's purposely said for the encouragement of the average believer who wonders if he's just average, or does God know his name, right? He calls them by name and leads them out. And he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. I don't think this, again, is teaching as though it's meant to be, from the front end taught that you always know when God is talking to you versus some other idea in your head or another God. But the idea, because we have 1 John 4:1, test the spirits. So it will be a constant challenge to the early church to listen carefully to what your mind is saying. But at the same time, Jesus is saying in the end, the larger story of which God you follow, that is knowing the voice of the God, or knowing the voice of Jesus, knowing the voice of God the Father, is what is symptomatic of a believer. They are following the general voice of their sheep or their shepherd. And that's going to be a story that goes all the way back to the Old Testament, which we'll pick up in just a moment. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, Jesus continuing the analogy, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this illustration, and again, I take this to mean the writer stops and says he was giving an extended parable, which again in Greek or the Hebrew word masal just means a story or a proverb, really, an extended proverb of a sheep and a sheep, or a shepherd and a sheepfold. But they did not understand the things which he spoke to them, probably meaning they didn't understand who was the bad guy here and who's the good guy and how this all fits back into an Old Testament story. So they weren't following every part of the story as carefully as Jesus described it to the crowd. Then Jesus said to them again, most assuredly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. Those who are really loyal to Yahweh, I take this to be the general meaning of the point, theoretically, that this is how it works. In theory, that if you are loyal to Yahweh, you will not follow a false voice. Okay, so this idea of false shepherds, here's where I think, Mike, it goes back to, if there's any Old Testament passage that sounds like this, to me it's Ezekiel 34. You the listener, if you have time just to open Ezekiel 34 and read the entire story, it's really beautiful how the story both includes the parabolic idea of a shepherd, but also of the covenant that God longs to make with post-exilic Israel. Again, because remember, Ezekiel is writing to people in Babylon who are now going through a sense that they're not God's people anymore. They have been taken off to, live under the guidance of another deity, frankly, where people worship Marduk there over there in Persia or Babylon. And so, and I'm just going to grab a couple verses to give a sense of what's in Ezekiel 34. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God to the shepherds, woe to the shepherds of Israel, who feed themselves. Should not the shepherd shepherds feed the flocks. There are what we would then call false shepherds. God is going after the leaders of Israel. I'm sure there were many at this point in Babylon, and Jeremiah had to put up with them before he, was taken down to Egypt. People that did not want to believe that Yahweh was all he was cracked up to be, to use a parlance word, because why would we be here if our God was that powerful? And so these shepherds were probably, we don't have a lot of information. We have very little, it's interesting, we have very little actual textual evidence of what Israel was learning from these shepherds in Babylon. We don't have anything written down from that place and that era. We have Talmudic ideas that come later, but that may be a result of the oral traditions being passed down in Babylon, but we have very little textual evidence of what, to use the point here, these shepherds would have been telling their people. So let's continue the passage, though. As God says, and I'm jumping up a few verses in Ezekiel 34, as a shepherd seeks out his flock, so I seek out my sheep. Where they were scattered on a cloudy and dark day. Beautiful illustration. I will gather them from the countries. Boy, that sounds like, Genesis 11. And I will feed them on the mountains of Israel. Again, there's that idea that they're coming back to God's promised land, at his covenant area. Okay, I will establish one shepherd over them, and he will feed them. Notice there now he turns this is God talking to Ezekiel, who in turn is talking to the people. And God says, I will establish, first he says, I will gather them, and then he turns it to another person. I will establish one shepherd over them, and he, third person, someone else other than Yahweh, shall feed them. So now you get that interesting, and again, Mike talks a lot about this, and there's various options. I always want to recommend to DCW folk that when we come to this issue of how to identify, we're going to get to Jesus, of course, coming up here in John 10, that we already have Old Testament stories that predict to some degree how Jesus will fit in also to let's do it here. Where God in one verse in Ezekiel 34 says, I, and then just a couple of verses later, he says, he, as though he's talking about someone else, right? What's interesting then is that this I to he, we'd want to say that to be the Messiah, I would suspect. I mean, I'm just thinking ahead if I was reading this in Babylon. And what I get is, he shall feed them my servant David. David? What do you mean David? He's long dead. Why would David be the person that God would choose to be the shepherd over his people? Well, clearly, David is, in one sense, fulfilling the I will seek out my sheep, but he's an agent, if not a role. He's not even living. He's not even going to be resurrected to do this. This is David dead and gone, but someone who will fulfill the role of David. Someone who will fulfill the role of David will be fulfilling the I, the God himself, right? Who's going to do this? It's going to be someone else. So to me, this is a good example of, and it's a challenge that, the DCW folk are always thinking through. How does Jesus fit into the Yahweh issue? And Dr. Mike, you had used the phrase two Yahwehs. Here would be an example where it's not David being a third Yahweh. It's David being an agent of Yahweh who is being credited with doing the work of Yahweh, but he's not Yahweh. So this would be, to me, an example of divine agency where David, or the role, someone who fulfills the role of David, will be fulfilling the role of I, or Yahweh himself. I will feed them. Well, it's really going to be David, or someone who's going to fulfill the role of David. So another one of those examples of the Old Testament where we both scratch our head and yet say, okay, God's up to something here, and how he is going to use, or how he's going to be related, as it were, to the Messiah. The coming Messiah will be obviously an issue of mystery to some degree, but in this story, it's simply the role of David in Ezekiel 34. Of course, David is the consummate shepherd too. So maybe that's why it's not just the king David, but it's the shepherd, as he even says, the servant David. So,
I mean, I think by the time we get to, this time period, David has, because we get one of the last books of the Old Testament being written is the Book of Chronicles, and David is casted in a very positive, generally positive light.
Totally.
And so you get this idea that David becomes more than just a man,
right,
than the actual historical man. And so, like, I understand what you mean about the agency, but I also could see how Dr. Heiser would have gone with that two Yahweh or two powers kind of demonstration, that it's more than just agency, and it's more than just simply fulfilling the role. There's going to be someone that's essentially perfect. there's even well better than the human David could have ever done or ever been. Anyways, that's just another conversation that we could wrap up.
Another one for another time, but but in a sense, we're right back to it again here, where we have Jesus saying, "I'm the good shepherd," and Jesus will claim now to be the shepherd, right? From Ezekiel 34. If you had this in your head, then as Jesus is saying, "I am." In fact, let's continue. Jesus said to them, this is in verse 7 now of John 10. "Most assuredly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." You are reflecting on Ezekiel 34, I think clearly. And you're saying to yourself, okay, you're claiming to be the role of David then. Is that what you're saying? Which really is not just the role of David. It is how Yahweh himself is going to bring those sheep together again. And again, so if I had pulled Jesus aside, wouldn't that have been fun? And said, how do you relate to Ezekiel 34? I think Jesus would have said, all parables aside, I am the fulfillment of the Son of David. I am and he would have started collecting many passages at this point, would be at Psalm 2, Psalm 45, Psalm 110, and he would have let those roll off his lips as, yes, I am him. So, but here is that one I would recommend, a clear allusion to a great passage that often we don't to spend a lot of time on, and that is Ezekiel 34. But it's because we're not pastoral people. We don't, get all excited about sheepfolds and shepherds. But in this era, it's a beautiful picture of. I did have a sheep back when I was growing up. We lived in a rural area. My dad was a pastor, and one of our members still is living on a farm with a lot of sheep, and he's always had a lot of sheep. And I even took my grandkids to see the sheep a couple of years ago, and boy, are they, as my farmer friend tells me, they are the dumbest animals. But they are so loyal to what they know they do. I mean, or how do you say that? They lead very simple lives. They're, as you may have heard this, they're very defenseless. They don't have a sense of where to go and what to do, except where you tell them and where you point them, and then you get, of course, like a sheep dog, that can guide them. But they are very content to basically be prey if they're not careful. And he loves the analogy of sheep for the believer, because he sees how that works. But that's the beauty of Ezekiel 34 and now John 10. So,
Ron,
go ahead. Yeah,
I'm just curious. Have you ever heard of Brian Neil Peterson?
No, don't know the name.
I'm just thinking if this might be a possible resource for us to maybe check out one day, or other folks to check out. It's I think Mike had actually mentioned this once. This scholar named Brian Neil Peterson, he wrote this basically exploration of John's use of Ezekiel. That's the title of his book. Okay. Understanding the unique perspective of the fourth gospel. And so he just does a deep dive. And I was just like looking through some of his notes as you were talking as well from John 10. Yeah, he sees the same kind of motifs and parallels coming out from Ezekiel 34.
What is the name of the author again?
Brian, B-R-I-A-N, Neil Peterson, P-E-T-E-R-S-O-N. It's a book from the Fortress Press folks. Came out around 2015.
Okay. No, I don't have it. Cool.
But yeah, it's a deep dive. He has actually an interesting, you and I have gone back and forth about the ego and me thing. Mm-hmm. He brings up, yes, it is a very common thing. It occurs about 54 times in John's gospel. But 38 of those times is with the ego and me. And so like he goes from 54, 45 of those times in John's gospel are uttered from Jesus's mouth.
Okay.
And 38 of those times is when he's adding the ego with the me. And so he's making he's making the argument there is some significance in like the 7 I am statements, and that there is something significant because the majority being, is not the only person to ever use the phrase, but it is very interesting that it shows up so heavily in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, fair enough that when it's used repeatedly, and this is a good conversation on its own, is if you're listening to the book and not reading it, would you have caught the number 7 uses of ego e me? If you're listening to a story, and again, a very literate person could say, yeah, I was counting, I was noticing them, and I noticed 7. So I don't want to say it can't happen. I guess, again, as a textual person myself, I don't listen to a story for the number of occurrences, but as though it's 7 and not 8 or 10, something like that. But interesting possibility. Again, I don't want to take away from what people who listened carefully could have heard. I think it's very possible to even hear things like that the average listener does not get today. Mm. Thank you. Verse 10 or verse 9. Here it is. I am the door. Ego e me. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Notice Jesus is not claiming to be the sheepfold. He's claiming to be the door of the sheepfold. He is the one through whom you understand, by analogy, I would say, and this is where the parable now, we could make it walk on all fours to some degree. Jesus is the means by which I know Yahweh. He's the means by which I enter the kingdom. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And I'm not taking away from him being the object of worship. I'm saying that he would himself say, I am the doorway to the Father. He's wanting always people to understand the Father through what he says. So The thief does not come except to kill, steal, and destroy. I have come that they may have the opposite, life, and that they may have it more abundantly. I am, ego e me, the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. So much of this we could spend time on, obviously. Beautiful, picturesque way of Psalm 23ing our way through, you and I. I even asked Chat this last week, sometimes again on my commute. I haven't turned the radio on in my car. I told Susan the other day, probably in 2 years, because I just find that listening to, like for this, getting ready for our podcast these last couple of weeks, I've just been listening to John 10, here and there. And other times, sometimes I'll just talk to Chat, GPT, and ask it my questions about something that I was thinking. And I said to Chat this last week, what does God think about me? I was just curious what an artificial intelligent response would be to this question. What does God, the God of the Bible, think about me? And of course, Chat's very polite. If you've ever talked to Chat, he says, excellent question. And it was a very interesting response. And how do I summarize it? Because I said more than that. I said, don't give me the cliched answer of that God loves me, because the Bible wasn't written to me. The Bible was written 2,000 years before I was even born. So don't give me and I'm talking away. Chat can take like a 10-minute conversation and answer it. It's fascinating to me. But I'm telling it, don't give me the cliche. I want to know, what does God think of me, Ron Johnson? How would I know what God thinks about me? And he was very good about, or it was very good about not being cliched. And what it came down to, let me just summarize it for this. and I think it was very well done, actually, is that the trajectory, and I'm going to paraphrase now, the trajectory of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures is that if you're in covenant with this God, you are known very personally by him. Bingo. I thought that was very well said. That the trajectory is one of covenant. If you, and here's language that Matthew Bates would use about being allegiant or loyal, if you go into covenant with this deity, you're going to be fine. He knows you by name. And Chat gave me a whole bunch of texts, whether it be biblical or even Second Temple stuff, where for the Jew, again, who was coming through tough times, be it Job or Ezra Nehemiah's era, that when they understood the covenant concept, their sigh of relief, shall we say, was utterable, was demonstrable. So it's all here in this, I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. Beautiful words by our Savior, and I think they're they're meant to be personally enjoyed, right? Especially this last line, and it has given rise to a lot of theology. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, giving his life for the sheep. There's a lot of ways to take this. Let me just take one angle I've never talked about, I don't think, here before. In the New Testament, Jesus' death for others, for, in our English word, overwhelmingly uses the preposition huper rather than anti. In Greek, you have two basic prepositions meaning for, or translated as for, one being huper, the other being anti. Huper, which is used here for the sheep, characteristically denotes an action on behalf of or for the benefit of another, emphasizing representation, solidarity, and proxy, rather than replacement. Okay? Jesus' death is therefore being framed here in John 10 as a beneficent act being carried out in the interest of the sheep or the people of God, and not as a substitute for them. By contrast, just in case someone wants to know, anti, the Greek preposition anti, which more naturally expresses substitution or exchange, translated instead of usually, is comparatively rare when it comes to Jesus' death and confined to narrowly defined ransom contexts, in which case, you have a lamb dying in the place of someone. The dominance of huper indicates that early Christian authors primarily construed Jesus' death as a representative, relational, and covenantal act done out of solidarity for others' benefits. And so when you start looking up huper as a preposition, and its relationship to Jesus' death, you have verses like Romans 5, Galatians 2, Romans 8, Ephesians 5, where in due time Christ died for huper, the ungodly, for scarcely for a righteous man will one die. These are all huper. Yet perhaps huper, for a good man, some would even dare to die. God demonstrates his love for us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. All these are huper. And huper is not talking substitution. It's talking benefit. He's doing it for the benefit of someone to follow. And I think that's important to catch, because when we have talk about Jesus dying for us, when we have huper used, I think it's just beneficial to the story of Israel and story of the covenant and story of, when Paul says, I die daily and I have died with Christ, that Christ died for me, but he did it for my benefit. It wasn't in place of me. I still have to die. I will physically die someday. Why? Because Jesus didn't die so that I wouldn't die. He died for my benefit, and therefore there's a story yet to tell. But I just find it helpful to, when we see that word, and since it's right in front of us here, the Good Shepherd gives his life huper, the sheep, for the benefit of the sheep. That's really what's being taught. Okay.
It does remind me of it does remind me of David Mitchell's work, Messiah ben Joseph. Okay. And it was his research dissertation as he dug down into the kind of the Jewish understanding of this messianic figure that's supposed to be the son of Joseph. Supposedly, this Messiah ben Joseph would show up before Messiah ben David. And one of the interesting things about Messiah ben Joseph is, as his kind of this idea developed, was that this son of Joseph would be so righteous that his own death would be accounted for as a way to wash over, or essentially cover over, the sins of national Israel. Yeah. And it was just an interesting thing of like, that so many, oftentimes we reduce salvation down to a very individualistic thing. Mm-hmm. And yet the ancient text often really was thinking of a very corporate solidarity type of model.
Totally. And I'll give evidence of that coming up. Yeah.
Yeah. The individual's part of it, but it's like, we're thinking big picture here. We're thinking the whole people. This is to take care of all of us, not just you and then another person and another person. It's the whole community. So anyways, I think it just kind of brought that up in my mind.
Practically speaking, to me, that's why no one in the Bible says, accept the work of the atonement on your behalf. That's never an invitation, because that's not why Jesus did it. He didn't do it so it's sitting out there to be taken. He did it for a purpose. And whether or not you take it, it's true. And yet, again, we make a gospel out of it. And I think it's totally misunderstanding the point. But all right, 10:12, I think we're up to verse 12. A hireling, one who does not own the sheep, Jesus continues, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. So you got two stories there. You got a hireling, a bad shepherd, who also sees a wolf. Now you got another party in the story that may be hard to identify, but maybe the wolf is a foreign deity that's coming after you. And this hireling, by analogy, again, I don't have Jesus explaining the parable to us. The wolf could be a ravenous deity that wants you to worship it, and the hireling would be a bad shepherd or a false shepherd who doesn't know the difference and lets you get eaten by this wolf. But anyway, the wolf catches the sheep, scatters them. The hireling flees because he does not care about the sheep. And if there's anything true about a false or a bad shepherd, is that really what makes the difference between Yahweh and the gods of the nations in the Old Testament, to be using this analogy now into a story or a narrative, is that they did not care for their people the way God cares for us and his people. I am the good shepherd. Here's another ego eimi. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father. I always get a kind of warm feeling, a sense of relief. I'm going to call it that honestly. When I hear Jesus say, even if in passing, listen, I know who the Father is. He knows who I am. And you guys, I know it's not going to work. I mean, there's just not enough for you to work with here. I and the Father have a relationship that nobody can understand deep down. Is that fair to say? In fact, I'm going to put Matthew 11 here on the screen, because to me, this is, again, interesting how he puts it. Matthew 11:27, completely different story, but he'll talk much the same way. All things, Jesus says, have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father. Nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and one to whom the Father wills to reveal him. He may be having a double entendre there about the average son and father who go about their duties, in ancient Israel. And you think you know Sam? Well, his son knows him better than you do, right? And you think you know the son? Well, no, his dad knows him better than you do. And maybe that double entendre then is meant to be appreciated here too, in the sense that Jesus is saying with a wink, oh, you think you know who Yahweh is? Let me tell you, no one knows him like I do, right? And no one knows me like he knows me. And if that's discouraging, the reason I like this, and it gives me a sigh of relief, is the next thing he says. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me. I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. That feeling of, oh, do I understand who God is followed by, don't worry about it. Just rest, knowing that I know him. And as you follow me, you'll get to know him better and better as well. So to Jesus, Christology was a a difficult doctrine. I just think we have to admit it. And he's just but he's saying on the other side of it, don't worry about it. Don't worry about your Christology on the level of being fearful. If you understand me, you understand the Father, and vice versa, and you can rest your soul in all of that. So, beautiful passage there in Matthew 11 to fall in line with John 10. Verse 16. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Ron, I guess maybe this is a little bit more philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there really if relationships can be placed on a spectrum of from a beginning towards infinity, after I'm actually thinking of one of these songs, after 1,000 years, will we be any more closer? Right? I think
yeah, it's philosophically, I could argue that no, we won't, because infinity can never be, you get 1/10 of the way there. You can't think like that. But
I guess I'm looking at it as not as a depressing thing, but it's just simply is that there will never be an end to actually discovery, right? Of actually learning and growing in relationship. It will never grow old. I guess that's how I would pose it, right?
Yeah,
versus
that's well said, because I mean, any version of Christian or of heaven or the afterlife that I've been told always ends up in either boredom or fear. Oh my goodness, do I want to do that forever? Are you sure? And again, the pastor, the preacher, the teacher is trying to do their best to make me excited about heaven. There's a book by Randy Alcorn, 20 years ago, called Heaven, and just between you and me, Mike, and whoever's listening. I did not like it. It was so, will there be coffee in heaven? Well, is coffee good? Yes. Okay, it's going to be in heaven. That was the argument at one point. It's maybe it just was made or written to encourage people, but page after page, I said to myself, if that's what heaven is, I can see why atheists don't want to go. That's not why I want to go. That's not. Anyway, and again, I don't want to offend Dr. Alcorn if he's listening, but although I just did. So, to me, heaven is. Go ahead.
I just think it's. I agree with you that I think a lot of our presentations, and also because it's also coming from that assumption that we'll be floating up in the sky with harps and whatever else, and not actually this concept that heaven and earth will finally become one, that a marriage will finally happen between the two. Right? C.S. Lewis used to call it the Great Divorce, and the way that I would, it's kind of funny. It's also flipped on the other side, that you get this kind of positive nihilism. Of wouldn't it be just great that one day we essentially just no longer exist? Essentially, a positive version of annihilationism, and that essentially the meme as it would go is that existence is pain, and I don't think going that direction is good either.
Oh no, nihilism to me is for reasons unto itself. I'm going to leave it alone, but it's not what I want either.
So I think there is just something we just have to acknowledge that the way that we've even tried to ever describe it is very lacking. And the fact that we're failing in describing it is probably because we haven't fully understood it, nor we really have a concept of what does it mean that heaven and earth will finally become one?
And nor can we. Right. Is it fair to say that as a human, I've never thought a divine thought? So since I've never had a divine thought, I've only had human thoughts. I can't imagine the divine world. Therefore, I can't imagine half the equation that you even mentioned there. So, well, that's another conversation for another day. Well, John 14, I go to prepare a place for you. Let's pick it up then. But for now, even as my Father knows me, so I know the Father. Verse 16, big point. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. If Jesus is talking to mainly a Jewish audience there around the temple area, clearly they know what this means, or Jesus has, intentions on this one. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them I must also bring. They will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Clearly this is angling toward Gentile inclusion. We're going to get to John 11. I want to just jump to it quickly because we're in John 10 now. But in John 11, this is where Caiaphas is talking. And he says, nor do you consider, verse 50, that it is expedient for who pair us, for our benefit, that one should die for who pair the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Now, this he did not say in his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, for their benefit, and not that nation only, but also. This is, again, so picturesque by the author of the book of John. He's putting it behind Caiaphas's statement that he didn't understand, actually, but also that he would gather, Jesus or God would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So this is going to be put on the lips of even a man who didn't understand it, that being Caiaphas later. But Jesus dying for the purpose of bringing into one family every nation. That's a big part of what I think, again, is behind the atonement. Reading it that way, I wish the Reformation would have done more with Ephesians 2:13 through 18 than it did. In other words, we often think of the Reformation based on, sola gratia, sola fide, Ephesians 2:8 and 9. But if you jump up to verse 13 of Ephesians 2, listen to how it sounds. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once afar off, here's the Gentile, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made both, Jew, Gentile, one, has broken down the middle wall of separation. There's that wall that was actually, about waist high around the entire temple, keeping Gentiles out. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man. That new man idea we often think of as, getting born again, but in the one new man concept, which I take from 2 Corinthians 5, and here in Ephesians 2 and Colossians as well, it's the new human that is both Jew and Gentile, yet without, shall we say, differentiation. From the two, thus making peace, that he might reconcile them both to God, that's Jew, Gentile, in one body through the cross. There's your Gentile atonement that gets them into the family, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off. Again, there's the Gentile. And to those who were near. I take that to be the Jew. For through him we both have access by one, here comes the Trinitarian side of the story of the gospel, the one Spirit to the Father. There's your Trinity in one sentence. Through Jesus, we have access by one Spirit to the Father. They're all three there. They all have a role to play. So that's, to me, when Jesus said, the Good Shepherd gives his life for the sheep, it's a word that is meant to be plural. And you had said that. It's a corporate concept usually, and we internalize it or we individualize it very commonly. But I think he's trying to give us that corporate sense. The reason he's laying down his life is for the plural sheep. So
there is such an interesting thing about how the cross becomes the place of meeting for the Jew and for the Gentile. It's just that. Anyhow, it touches back, like I'm just remembering the sermon I preached last time. It was just simply how the cross, our series was called God's Messy Family Tree. And I eventually, went from the family tree as that we normally think of like the genealogies essentially to, well, we really ultimately have a family tree that is quite messy, and it's the cross. This tree that both the Jew and the Gentile, we find our brokenness, our pain, our longing for belonging, all met in this one messy tree. And it's anyhow, it is just something I'm still always just going back and reflecting on, just how this tree is much better than the tree that our forefathers and foremother had eaten from. Anyways, look, we can move on, but that was just, oh goodness. The cross is
a lot of trees. There's a lot of trees in the Bible, and two main ones.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah,
a lot of
they
trees.
all play out another story that could be played out for interesting conversation. Verse 17, therefore my Father loves me because I lay down my life that I may take it again. Don't ever look past that love for Jesus that the Father has. Let me give you an idea, two ideas here, Mike. Again, I'm sticking my neck out. The who Jesus is question often takes center stage in Christian theology. I'm using this in my theology book that I'm writing. So I'll give you a paragraph here, a sample paragraph of it that I came up with. The who Jesus is question often takes center stage in Christian theology, even being used as the line separating Christians from non-Christians. To some degree, I think we have to go down that path. I would recommend that what the Father thinks about Jesus' question is more important to the biblical story. In other words, I may ultimately misunderstand the essence of Jesus' being issue and yet be found a loyalist or a believer simply because I responded properly to the Father's love of his Son. If this is the case, it follows that a biblical presentation of the gospel should begin not with man's sinfulness, but with God's love of Jesus. In the end, inviting someone into the family of God through the story of the Father's love of the Son would ultimately include all those elements of a gospel with which we are traditionally familiar: our sin, God's holiness, Jesus' life, death, teaching, resurrection, ascension, and our faith. But now these would be placed in their proper setting within the bigger story. So it's a lot there, but my recommendation is when I hear Jesus say, just kind of again in passing, therefore my Father loves me. Is it Ephesians 1? In the beloved one. You're accepted in the beloved, in Jesus. I'm accepted in him, and that idea of Jesus being beloved, we talked about it, from John 3 and John 5 and so forth before, but I think that theme again of the Father's love of the Son, if there's one thing for me, if we could begin the gospel for the Awana 6-year-old that my granddaughter is going into Awana, if she didn't learn Romans 3:23 first, but instead learn John 10:17, my Father loves me, I think we're on a better footing for how the gospel is going to play out.
Ron, I think I'm coming at this from it's been kind of strange. It's been a journey of like 2.5 years of being a part-time preaching pastor, but just in the end, still being a pastor and learning what it means heart-wise, what it means to care for the people in my church more than just being a fellow member of the church. And I totally get what you're talking about. And I think one of the things that sometimes those of us who are very into apologetics, there's nothing wrong with that. But we kind of often forget that when you're on the ground dealing with people who are and working with people who are just literally coming off the street because they saw your church sign and for some reason had a thought, I should go inside and check that out. I've never been to church before. You don't really have to convince people that sin exists.
Oh, I know. We've been
you don't have to convince people.
Block. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you don't have to convince people that there's brokenness, there is pain. What often, and also I found, is that even from a conversation I had with my dad, who is not a Christian, I think, or maybe, I'm not sure, but I never had to explain to him the concept of forgiveness, complete forgiveness, or unconditional love. Mm-hmm. What I had to convince him, though, was it actually could exist. That for some reason, he understood the concept, but it was too unbelievable to actually think that it could really exist in this world. Mm-hmm. Yet some reason we all can fathom it, but we just don't think it's possible they could really exist in the real world. And I think that if anything, that's always kind of been like a little nugget that's been in my mind, that you don't have to tell people and convince them that they're sinners, even if they don't ever admit it with their lips. Everyone knows there's something not right within ourselves. Like we don't want to admit that publicly. It's just, you don't have to do that convincing.
See, here's the thing, Mike. You know my story. I'm a preacher's kid. I go off to Bible college, seminary. I start immediately teaching Bible college, do it for 24 years. Then I'm pastoring, as well. And then I joined the secular workplace. And I work at, Fortune 500 companies in the just regular workday hours with regular people. And I realized how much I misrepresented them in the classroom. They didn't have a voice. They weren't allowed in. These were Christian colleges. So we talked about non-Christians all the time, how bad they were and how evil they were and all blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and that echo chamber multiplied itself because they weren't there. They couldn't talk about their own hopes and dreams and fears and sins. Now that I'm shoulder to shoulder with them, they're just like me. The only difference is the God we worship. And I mean that seriously. The only difference is the God we worship. And to me, that story now works. Now I can talk to them about life. I don't have to I don't have to talk about their sin. They already know that. Yeah. They don't know, though, who God is often. A lot of the folks I have, I'd say majority. And some do, but some don't. And I can tell that they're missing their understanding of who Jesus is. And that's where it all starts. And if I could, again, that elevator door is closing, and if I could scream anything, it'd be, God loves Jesus. God loves Jesus. That's the person you give your life to, because the Father has given, here we go to Daniel 7. The whole story wraps around who is God giving the kingdoms of the world to, right? So anyway, I don't want to get too far afield, but you really hit a nerve there when you talk about this, or I forget what you said, but the idea that I taught in Bible college is to Christians and we never allowed the non-believer in, I think caused a lot of misunderstanding about the world out there. So we got to keep moving, but thank you. 10:18, no one takes it from me, that is his life, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it again. Again, that's, where does he get that power? He says, this command I receive, this authority I receive from my Father. He always backs off and says, don't think I'm on my own here. This is something I have received. I've been sent. I have been given by the Father. Therefore, there was a division again among the Jews because of these sayings, and many of them said, wouldn't you know that this is how they talk? He has a daimonion. Again, I wouldn't say demon. I know we want to say demon, but that's such an anglicized word that we lose sense of what he means. They said, he's got a daimonion and is mad. Why do you listen to him? Others said, these are not the words of one who has a daimonion. Can a daimonion open the eyes of the blind? So there's an interesting, maybe even a weakness to my own view of what a daimonion is, because it's said as though it's a proverbial truism in their world that daimonia, are not able to give sight to blind people. And again, Mike has his view on where demons come from, and a lot of us, have different opinions on that, and that's, again, all part of a divine counsel worldview. But in at least this case, they're looking at this man who just in chapter 9 had his eyes opened, and they're claiming, well, we know that daimonia can't do that. So whatever they thought those daimonia were, they can't do big miracles like this. So again, just said in passing.
Would it be fair to say that it's pretty much almost, maybe their assumption is daimonion, whatever they are they have no ability to actually create something that is like, so for example, with the blind man, to actually bring about some sort of restoration of life, of infusing life into anything in creation. They can corrupt, they can break it down just like any human being can, just make things worse, but not necessarily actually restore.
Interesting.
Because they're not the creator.
Yeah, they're not the creator. Okay, fair enough. So now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem in winter. Jesus said, did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keeps the law? I think Jesus would love to go down that path. You guys make all these laws, and then you break them. Every time you try to follow one, you break two others. And the crowd, and the reason I'm just keeping moving here, because he keeps coming up. The crowd answered, yelled out, you have a daimonion. The Jews said, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a daimonion? Now they're even equating Samaritan, the concept of being a Samaritan, living just north there of Judea, and have a daimonion. So I think, again, the Jewish mindset is that people in Samaria have given their life, in some sense, to a foreign deity, maybe even a group of or a single daimonion. So that's why they throw the Samaritan epithet in there. And Jesus answers back, again, this is a theme, I do not have a daimonion, but I honor the Father, my Father. So the opposite of having a daimonion is honoring the true Creator. So whatever a daimonion is, that's why I'm not using demon yet, because I think, again, demon is too much packed into it that we don't want here. Whatever a daimonion is in their world, it was, in Jesus' mind, the opposite of honoring his Father. Yeah, as he says in verse 49, and you dishonor me. So a lot of daimonions back and forth there. Again, I have shown this, I think, before on our screen. This is the Bauer, Art, and Gingrich Donker Greek lexicon that is standard fare for anyone learning Second Temple Judaism Greek, or New Testament Greek for that matter. Daimonion, in his or their definition, the daimon family refers in general to powerful entities that transcend ordinary experience. After Homer's time, the adjective daimonios means anything, quote, sent from heaven, or, quote, that which is divine. And the substantive ta daimonion comes to mean divine manifestation or heaven, as in our expression, what heaven decrees. So very general answer to what a daimonion is in BAGD, but we have to leave it at that for time. Again, a whole conversation, what is daimonion, and certainly look at Dr. Heiser's work on angels and demons, because I totally respect his understanding of that world. And, well, not that any human can totally understand the divine world, but we appreciate those that spend time studying what they can about it. Continuing on, Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch, again, this huge 14-acre campus of a temple. Then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, how long can you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christos, the Messiah, tell us plainly. That gives evidence that there's this messianic secret that some have talked about, where Jesus seems to be, it does this in Mark more than in John, I think, but he gives parabolic teachings on things that could have been more just stating a fact. And they're catching him here. How long will you keep us in doubt? Be more clear. Jesus said, well, I told you, and you do not believe. Fair enough. If I keep saying it and you don't believe me, I'm not going to waste my time. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. Okay, I just healed a blind man. I gave life to dead eyes, and you just walk away. But you do not believe, interesting phrase here, because you are not of my sheep. The reason you don't believe is you're not a sheep. Now, does that have a Calvinistic sense of here's the cause of belief? This is often used to define or to state or to argue for why a person comes to faith in Christ, because God himself works within that person to become a sheep, then become a believer, right? Belief comes as a result of quickening of the person's understanding and even of his heart. This verse is sometimes used that way. And as stated, I can see why. But again, is Jesus teaching it this way, or is he just making a case that the reason you're not a believer is because you're not a sheep, and they are one and the same? My sheep hear my voice. I know them. They follow me. And I give them eternal life. They shall never perish, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. Again, a verse very commonly used for eternal security. Again, whether Jesus is teaching eternal security or not, both sides use the same verse. Remember, everyone has all the verses. So to use a verse like my college students would do and say, here's a verse that teaches eternal security, I always pushed back with red pen. I would circle it and I would say, now you need to tell me why people who don't believe in eternal security know that this verse is here, and how they translate it and or interpret it. And of course, the quick answer back is snatching them out of my hand doesn't mean you can't walk away. It just means that if you want to stay in Jesus' hand, no one's going to snatch you. So that's all it teaches us, is that there's no snatching. But it doesn't teach it's not getting into the issue then of a person, if they want to walk away from God, can they, right?
Yeah, it doesn't deal with that. Okay, Ron, the way that I react to this, I never grew up in those camps. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little kind of surprised that that's how it's read, because I read this and what comes in my mind is, don't mess with Jesus.
I agree. That's totally, no one snatches out of my hand, right? I'm in firm control.
Don't you come near. Don't you dare do this.
Good point. That's really what
that's how I would read it, because he's saying, I'm the good shepherd. What does a good shepherd do? I'm going to kill the wolf. I'm going to kill whatever tries to take the sheep.
This teaches don't mess with Jesus. It doesn't teach eternal security at all. It doesn't have to. In other words, it's not. This would not be the verse to prove it. Yeah. My Father who has given them to me. Again, notice the agency always being reminded here, who's in charge, who has given them to me is greater than all. No one's able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. So I'm doing what my Father's doing. He gives them to me. You don't snatch them out of my hand, but you also don't snatch them out of his hand. And then he comes with this very famous phrase, I and my Father are one. John 10, verse 30. The Greek word for one there, hen in Greek, it looks like N to those who read Greek, but it has a rough breathing, hen, are one. Again, I'm not opposed to Trinitarianism per se when people often say, or it's just a conversation that we've always had in the Christological discussion is, are you Trinitarian or are you not, or how do you define Trinitarianism? My only nervousness is that people use poor arguments for their Trinitarianism. To me, if a person, especially when I sat on licensure boards and ordination councils, when the candidate would say something like, I believe in the Trinity, and the chairman wanted to move on because he said it the right way, I was always kind of the one, and I often did this. I shouldn't have, but I always found myself wanting to be the person in the room, sometimes the only one, who wanted to say, well, what do you mean by that? You just said something that makes no sense. God is three and God is one. What do you mean by that? And my point to the candidate, and I didn't have a lot of power, I was just one of the the quizzers, as it were, was don't use words you don't know what they mean. Because you're going to be in the ministry, 2 months, and some 10-year-old is going to ask you a question, and he doesn't want a cliche. He wants to know what you really mean. And as C.S. Lewis used to always say, if you can't explain it to a 10-year-old, you don't know what you mean. And so here's the point, that when we say, I and my Father are one, hen, don't use this in a wrong way. Because, go ahead and use it, but don't get caught saying something that you don't know what you're saying. Here's the point, that when you follow through on that word hen in Greek, you will find that it's really much broader than you want it to be, shall we say. In John 17, we'll see this later, but I'm going to show it now. Holy Father, keep through your name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are. That they all may be one, same Greek word, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be one in us. So in other words, if Jesus is one with the Father, so I am one with Jesus and the Father as well. That the world may believe that you sent me, and the glory which you gave me I have given to them, that they may be, watch what he does here, that they may be hen, just as we are one, hen. Whoa. If Jesus and Yahweh are one, and then I have in John 17, Jesus praying that I would be one just as they are one. That's pretty shocking, I guess I would say. And so if a candidate in a licensure board is saying Jesus and Yahweh are one, and then he just ends it there, I would say, well, what about John 17:23? How do you take that verse in relation to the Trinitarianism that you thought was in John 10:30? And again, usually I always got the sense that they wanted to move on from those kind of questions because they got too particular, but I thought that's why I'm there, is to run those questions down. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, Ron, because I guess where I would go with that, the whole entire unity with Christ, I mean, that's part of also the whole process of theosis that we always kind of harken back into.
Right.
Right. Because like, that was also just, that was another, like I said in one episode, I preached a sermon at my church on theosis without ever using the word theosis.
Good. I would recommend that.
But that's how I view it, is that what is going on is that the Father and I are one. Like, this is the ultimate life. This relationship is amazing. Guess what? Because of Jesus, our unity with him is that invitation now to experience that same kind of life. Yeah. And thus, going back into that conversation about reaching affinity, it's not about boredom. I think we will never find an end to what does that really feel like, experience like, and be like. Oh. And so anyways, that's how kind of maybe if I was going through some sort of relationship board with you, I probably would kind of go down that way. That I think there's an allusion to some theosis or deification.
I never had any candidate talk about theosis in my board licensures, because I was dealing with denominations that didn't have any time for that language. That's interesting now that I look back upon it. So they probably would not have been, or they probably have been voted down, or been, the moderator would have said, "What are you talking about?" And gone down that path. But interesting.
Which is, it's disappointing, because I think, theosis and deification material has been so studied by our Eastern Christian brothers and sisters. Right. And a lot of that was, at least my conjecture is that the reason why it became so important for them, especially with the rise of Islam, it became important for them because essentially, oftentimes they found themselves very isolated. And if the life that they are experiencing, their only hope, their only anchor for sustenance through everything they went through was that divine life of that divine community.
That's so well said. Yeah, it's just not part of our conversation. It needs to be. Well, if you're listening and you believe in a divine council worldview, which I hope you do, this is part of your world. Deification. And I know it sounds weird, but study it, because it's part of the divine council worldview. We got to move on, but thank you. This oneness is also in 1 Corinthians 3, 6-8, 10:17, Galatians 3:28. We are all one, same Greek word. We are all one in Christ Jesus. Romans 12, one body, many members, but one body in Christ. So the point being, I and the Father are one. It doesn't answer the how question, but it does set us up for, well, let's keep thinking about this. How is Jesus and the Father one? And he says, John 17, I want everyone else to be one the same way I am with him. So I am with the Father. That's a conversation to keep going down, but it obviously doesn't solve Trinitarianism as much as introduce another angle into it. So then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which one of those works do you stone me? I've been doing miracles for a while now, and again, he's just trying to be honest about this problem. Why are you going to stone me? Jews answered, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being an anthropos, make yourself theos. Again, there's no article there. I don't think they're saying you want to be Yahweh. I think they're saying you, being a man, make yourself. Here's my translation. My personal translation would be a small g. You, being a man, make yourself a deity. A small g would really cause trouble in the pew. I understand that. So I don't know of any major Christian version that puts small g there, but I think the Greek would call for that. You, being a man, make yourself a deity. In that world, deities did, come to earth. There is no capital G. Again, we've been through this, right, Mike? There's no capital G God in Greek thinking. Everything's a small thos, theos, and you have to define the theos to know if we're talking about the capital G version. But at this point, I think they're simply saying, you, being a man, are making yourself divine. In their world, you don't do that. You don't make yourself, take upon yourself call yourself a deity if it's not you, or, you have not shown that. And so, yeah, the Senate can vote when an emperor has died, whether they're a deity or not. And they did that all the time with the Roman emperors. But the point being, a guy standing in front of them in the temple courtyard claiming to be a deity, that's why they're picking up a stone to throw at him. Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law?" And he brings up Psalm 82, and we'll end with this quickly. We've often wondered, Mike has the story of listening to Psalm 82 in Sunday school, and it changed his life. He changed my life a couple years later when he is talking about his dissertation in the St. Paul Cafe, and he draws, pictures on a napkin, which I still have. And that changed my life. He didn't use Psalm 82 to change my life. He used, what verse? We were in Exodus, I think 23 at the time. But anyway, what verse of the or what passage of the Old Testament do you find important to defend the divine counsel worldview? Mike uses Psalm 82. I use Psalm 8 now. And Jesus, he actually votes with Mike. Jesus goes right to Psalm 82 in front of these people who are about to stone him for claiming to be a deity. And here's his answer. Is it not written in your Torah? And he picks up a psalm to, match Torah here. I said you are gods. That's Psalm 82. I forget the verse that he's grabbing there, but you are Elohim. Remember in Psalm 82, Yahweh is sitting among, verse 6, okay? Yeah, and of course the whole psalm is about Yahweh bringing together this group of beings and condemning them for their misuse of authority over the human race and over the nations that they have been given authority. But all Jesus does is grab a line out of it, and he says, "Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods?" Theoi in Greek, it would have been Elohim in Hebrew. If he called them gods, plural, to whom the word of God came, and by the way, the scripture can't be broken. He's just saying, now be consistent now. Do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent, that is me, I am the one who the Father has sanctified, made ritually pure for the purpose of what I'm doing, and sent. I'm the sent one. How do you say of him, you are blaspheming because I said I'm the Son of God? Okay, so let me finish the verse and then we'll talk about his use of the psalm. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do, though you do not believe me, believe the works at least, that you may know and believe that I and the Father, or that the Father is in me and I in him. Well, let's get back to that use of John 10. How does Jesus use John 10:34-36, or what is his point in that I have said you are gods, or it's in your law, I am gods? Here's my opinion, and I used this argument. I remember in my own dissertation process, one of my readers said, you need to spend time on John 10, simply because Jesus quotes Psalm 82, which if you're going to talk about New Testament principalities and powers, you've got to nail down why Jesus used Psalm 82, and it's a good point. So I remember spending an entire day just poring over anything I could find on John 10 and its use of Psalm 82. Here's what I came up with just as a simple summary for the sake of our conversation here. Jesus' point is not to demote the Elohim of Psalm 82 to mortals, which is often an argument, but to argue from the greater to the lesser. If even other divine beings could bear the title Elohim under Yahweh's authority without blasphemy, so says Jesus, how much more may the one whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world? See, in other words, none of those guys were sanctified and sent into the world. How much more, then, may the one whom the Father sanctified and sent claim to be the Son of God? In other words, how in the world can you say I'm blaspheming if they are Elohim and they weren't even sanctified and sent? Theologically, it doesn't prove that I am an Elohim, but you're really misunderstanding the psalm. You're misunderstanding Psalm 82 if you think you can say I'm blaspheming by claiming to be deity when God says there are deities and they weren't even sanctified and sent as I was. So my summary would end with this. Jesus' argument assumed a genuine plurality of divine beings, sons, he will call them, subordinate to Yahweh, and we have no evidence that Jewish interpretation of Psalm 82 took these beings to be human judges. That's why when you read a commentary on John 10 and have these theoi or Elohim being human judges. I don't know where they get that. I just don't. Otherwise, Jesus' logic makes no sense, which would sound like this. Humans can be called human judges, so I can be divine. Well, again, that makes no sense. You have to have divine beings in Psalm 82, thus in John 10, in order for Jesus to claim that he's not blaspheming because he's been sanctified and sent, and they weren't. So anyway, that's my argument from John 10. It's not a long one. Obviously, Jesus doesn't spend a lot of time arguing his case, but he is appealing to a great Old Testament passage again of Psalm 82. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, finish it up. Last verses. Therefore, they sought. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was curious. There was an update in the Unseen Realm, the expanded edition. Mike actually did include an extra little bit about the John 10 passage. Okay. Curious, would it be worthwhile to read a little bit of what he wrote here?
Go ahead.
I mean, a few caveats, right? I think where Mike differs with what you're mentioning, Ron, he thinks that the claim of blasphemy was that they thought that he was claiming to be the God, right? Yahweh. God. Yeah. And so, okay. and part of it, I understand. I actually think I favored that because I'm also remembering that, well, it's a bunch of Jews. It's a whole bunch of Jews who are like, and their normal use, if they were to use the word theoi, would it always necessarily be that they're just thinking about divine world, or are they actually thinking about like, well, there's only one real theoi that really counts in their minds?
Well, they know that theoi is a term that the Old Testament, thou shalt have no other theoi before me. So they know they're out there, right? Even a good Jew knows they're out there.
But anyhow, I mean, the caveat it, Mike thinks, he said that's one of his pre-assumptions is that Jesus is, the charge against him is that he's making himself out to be God.
Does he use a capital G in that sentence there?
Yeah. He said this claim was regarded as blasphemy in that Jesus was making himself out to be God with a capital G. In defense of his assertion, Jesus quotes Psalm 82:6. That is, to establish his claim to be God, Jesus went to Psalm 82:6. He follows the quotation with the statement that the Father was in him and he was in the Father. And so eventually he gets to this point of where he views of his own personal view of this. He says, I had it just underlined.
Mm-hmm.
Here he is. He says, my view is that Jesus is quoting Psalm 82:6 to put forth the idea that he was more than human. He reminds his Jewish audience that there are in fact other Elohim besides the God of Israel. Mm-hmm. And those Elohim were God's sons. Because Jesus calls himself the Son of God and has just claimed to be one with Yahweh, he not only puts himself in the class of the sons of the Most High, mentioned in Psalm 82:6, divine Elohim, but implies that he is the Lord of the council. This particular Son of the Most High is one with the Father. The Jewish authorities got the message too. They charged Jesus with blasphemy. Now ask yourself, why would they do that if all Jesus was saying, you mortal Jews get to call yourselves sons of God and Elohim, so I can too? That makes no sense at all.
Right. And there's the human judges idea.
Yeah. Unfortunately, even in the last couple of weeks, I remember there have been, for some reason, this uptick of folks attacking Dr. Heiser, especially around Psalm 82:6, and just making the blanket statement. We all know that Psalm 82:6 is talking about human judges, which you have to do a lot of cartwheels back to taking something out of context with what God was saying to Moses regarding Aaron and him, and a few other things in order to get to that place of it's about human judges. I mean, every commentary that I've seen actually studies the history of Psalm 82. They all point back to like, this is probably one of the oldest Psalms, technically. And so would call back to very primordial ancient times that they're not thinking of judges. They're not thinking of human beings. And the fact that the ending of that psalm is those divine beings, those Elohim, they will die like mortals. Mm-hmm. How does a God die?
Right.
So,
well, it's a conversation then to be had, as to how that death, shall we say, is being poetically described for an Elohim. So I take that demotion of their status, whatever that be, die like mortals, to be parallel to what Paul will do to the principalities and powers when they are defeated and they're cast into the lake of fire and all that kind of description in the New Testament. It's very poetic, very symbolic, and I don't doubt there's symbolism there. But how do you kill an Elohim? We don't have words for it. So. Good. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, please, everyone, get the new updated Unseen Realm and pour over Mike's work as much as you can, because I appreciate it too. And the time and care he puts into his arguments are worth every cent. We close up John 10. Therefore they sought to seize him, but he escaped from them. He went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing at first. There he stayed. He had a safe haven somewhere out near the Jordan. Many came to him and said, John performed no sign, but all the things that John spoke about this man were true, and many believed, pisteuoed him there. So he's finding believers out there on the Jordan riverbank. Interesting way to end a very tense passage there about the use of Psalm 82 and the disbelief of the Jewish leadership. If there's anything to be said about John 10, and by the way, I have often asked Chat, just because Chat knows the Divine Council worldview in and out. I mean, and I say this to our listenership. If you ever feel lost about what a Divine Council worldview believes about something, whether it be a passage or an idea, ask AI. AI knows DCW stuff in and out. It's read Mike's stuff. It's read John Walton's stuff. It's read John Goldengate's stuff. It's read Greg Boyd's stuff. People who know DCW, in other words, AI knows that world. It knows our world. And so if you ask any AI chatbot or whatever DCW questions, get ready for a long-winded and usually excellent answer because it's very well versed in it. We are not on the sidelines anymore, folks. We are front and center in a lot of conversations, even within the AI world. In fact, with that, I'm going to close. We've been at this a long time, Mike, John 10, and I'm ready to pack it up if you are. Anything else?
Well, I would encourage, besides also the AI, Mike did present a paper at ETS years ago on the relationship between John 10 and Psalm 82. Mm-hmm. What he had in the Unseen Realm book is essentially a distillation of that paper. I read it. It goes way into the minutiae. It's like examining the gravel, like you would like to say. Like he gets into the words like logos. He gets into the words of going throughout the psalm and through Jesus's parsing of Psalm 82:6. So I would encourage, if folks are really wanting to deep dive, just Google for John 10 Michael Heiser, and you'll find the paper available for free. Cool. So, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike, again for listening to me go on and on. And I appreciate everyone's ability to hang with it. We are going to get into, I think, the crisis text of the book of John next time, John 11, when Jesus resurrects a man from the dead, or at least resuscitates him for the sake of a term. And I think it's going to be one of the, it's the chapter we've been waiting for in order to get us going into the last week of Jesus' own life. So until then, we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.